Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. All right, well, welcome to the Faith Over Breakfast podcast. My name is Eric Deepen, and I am pastor of the Village Church in Tucson, Arizona. And across from me is
Andy
Littleton.
Mission Church.
Mission Church.
And it was a good time. We discussed a question that we got in. It has to do with more ancient forms of worship, liturgies. But the question is this sustainable when younger people who are now getting potentially more interested in this, is this movement going to last, or is this a temporary thing? And I don't know that we solved that, but we
just mumbled our way through it.
Actually, I think it's really interesting. If there's any part of you that kind of wonders about this, or frankly, if you plan to have kids and raise them in the church, the last part of the episode is especially helpful.
I think so. So there's a couple of housekeeping things that we need to take care of. One of our promotionals that we are starting is called Andy and Eric's Bookshelf.
I had no idea this was coming. Oh,
he
right.
does. Andy and Eric have lots of books that they don't read anymore or even think are useful. But you might.
Or they might be useful to you.
They might be useful to you. So if you send in a question.
All right.
And you are in the 50 states. We're going to limit this because it's rather expensive for us to mail them outside of the 50 states. If you get a question, you ask it, give us your address, and Andy and Eric will pull a book off their shelf. And Andy said, give us a little bit of your interests, and maybe we can fit something into that. We'll mail you a book from our bookshelf.
There you go. That's true.
I'm very excited about that. The other thing is Laura Seepin emailed us, and she asked a question. And the question was, could you have your wives on?
Yeah.
And I think we might be able to arrange that. That would be an interesting podcast.
That would be an interesting podcast. And we have discussed having our youth pastors on.
Yes.
That was an interesting thought too. So.
And that's in the works. I just need to email Rick Drost and get him there, and then we'll see about your youth leader.
By in the works, you mean we have thought about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
As busy pastors who do this podcast on the side.
Yeah. And we have some other topics that we've engaged. So anyway.
Yeah.
Brace yourselves. It's going to be real.
We're ready.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
This is exciting.
We're coming
for you.
Enjoy the podcast.
All right.
Yeah, I'm quiet. Check it. Check. Check. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2.
So one of the things is you do talk quieter and then you have a really loud laugh. Yeah, there you go. I'll put that on repeat so it just goes. There you go.
That can be the intro. Oh, Eric, you know I'd love that.
Oh, I know you would.
I would. Oh man.
Well, I'm too loud. So I mean, I could fix it, but I just don't have the time to bother with fixing your laugh, so then it ends up a little quieter. Even though I've compressed it and stuff, I just don't spend that much time on it.
Which is why if you sponsor this podcast for just $100 a month, we will hire a professional editor.
Yes, we will.
And so if this bothers you enough, dig deep, my friends, and
dig deep.
You can help us.
Because if you wonder, why is Andy quiet? Well, it's
because we do this for
I do a
nothing.
Total of, for those of you who do sound editing and stuff, 10 minutes of editing on this podcast.
And I do an approximate 10 minutes of complaining, but then doing nothing to solve the problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because he could just pay $100 himself.
And dig deep personally and show his actual commitment to his own podcast.
Yeah. Hey, so by the way, let's just acknowledge one of our listeners who we're not going to talk about today, but my sister-in-law, Laura, emailed us on Faith Over Breakfast and just said, hey, I love you guys. So, Laura, we are going to send you a book, and we're sending Jacob a book. So there are no more books that Andy wrote available.
The ship has sailed.
Well,
from us.
They're
on Amazon.
Yes, Amazon.
Yeah. Just a key
right?
couple in my church I realized they didn't know I'd written anything. I mean, they're very involved. Here's my point. They're very involved. And it came up, I mentioned something about, I even touched on that in my book once. And they said, what book? I was like, oh, what?
What, you don't listen to the podcast? You don't know I wrote a book? What's going on?
And this is partly because outside of social media, I guess I don't really talk about it.
Yeah, you don't talk about it a lot. And, this is similar. I was over at my in-laws, and they're all talking about, what about that Salad and Go place? I'm like, you obviously don't listen to the podcast.
We have talked
about Salad and Go.
We have, yeah.
We thought maybe they'd even be a sponsor of our podcast.
I did email them, and it's been crickets. Hey, you know what? It was worth a shot. Well, sometimes knock and the door shall be left closed unto you.
Right.
Anyway, hey, so
we're going to talk about Jacob Lewis's.
Yeah, we got a great question from Jacob, and we had said you had to live somewhere else, and the great thing is that Jacob moved out of town, and then he qualified, so he gets his book and his question. But I should say,
the funny thing is that he's going to Spain, right?
That's the plan.
But we're mailing it to Phoenix.
Because
I appreciate that, Jacob.
That is helpful. Yeah, the visas are kind of held up.
Cost us $20.
Ooh, yeah. Wow. That's
so if you want to know where the budget goes.
We could have produced a podcast. Anyway, yes. So we are sending Jacob a book. And I should just say this before, real quick. We missed this guy. Jacob and Laura. These were people who at our church are beloved friends, and I hope they come back. So as this goes out there, Jacob, miss you, man. And Laura,
so what
very
is
much.
Jacob doing in Spain?
So Laura has like some work lined up, and like I said, their visas are in flux, and Jacob's going to find some while they're there. It's probably a year.
Okay.
And yeah, they're a young couple. It's going to be cool for them to get to go and experience this. I'm excited for them.
That's a cool deal right there.
Yeah. And anyway, that's very cool. So they will be missed. Hopefully it's a great experience. And hopefully talking about this question is helpful. So
let's outline the question.
Yeah, and maybe I should read it, but let's see how much I'll
fill you in where you mess up.
Okay, let's see how much I remember. Essentially, it's this idea of the more ancient forms of worship, and Jacob is bringing up that some people are wanting to return to high liturgies, if you will, and more ancient forms of worship. I assume that would include things like following the church calendar and maybe
reciting creeds and confessions and common book of prayer, maybe.
Yeah.
Or if you're in the Orthodox Church, even being part of the being done in the Greek language or in Latin, if
utilizing
you're Catholic.
Icons,
yes,
potentially.
The utilization of icons, incense, things like that.
Yeah, and he didn't make this list, but these are things that tend to fall into those categories. And so I think the core of his question, I thought, was, is this actually a sustainable way to keep faith vibrant for the people moving that direction? Or is this just a fad? And should we really be trying that hard to embrace some of this stuff if it's kind of a fad?
And he linked it, by the way, to Jordan Peterson and some of his friends who were not followers of Jesus, who are beginning to explore faith, and instead of maybe coming through the door of such an ordinary Protestant church, they were going through the door of the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church, where there's a perceived connection to something more ancient, and less revolutionary in the sense of Protestants are protesting things in their origins.
Yeah. Okay, right. So, he did engage Peterson, and that people were basically getting intrigued by faith through voices such as Peterson's who are outside of the church, and then they're getting to look at the many ways to enter into the church, and sometimes, if not often, opting for some of these more ancient versions. And he's wondering, is that sustainable? So, okay, here we are at breakfast. I have coffee.
I had breakfast with my daughter.
You had breakfast? I know. That's so nice of you.
Thank you.
And
I'm a nice guy.
So this is the breakfast table conversation. So what's you've talked about some of these things more than me classically over the years. Our church has a liturgy. I'm a believer that every church does. We just don't call it that.
And a liturgy is just the process that you go through when you get there on Sunday to worship God.
Yeah.
And you have set things that you do.
The work of the people.
Yes.
But yeah, so why have you engaged in some of that?
Yeah, and well, the village is oddly very liturgical in the traditional sense. We follow the church calendar. We practice Lent. We celebrate Eastertide. We see the summer and part of the fall as the common time when you do discipleship. And then we 9 times out of 10 celebrate Advent. We'll always celebrate Advent, but it sometimes is not as in the forefront.
Yeah.
So we go through this process, and then we'll then what is the after Christmas? It's called I'm just blanking right now. But anyway, the time between Lent and Christmas is a particular thing that I forget. But so we celebrate that. We proclaim the creed, the Apostles' Creed. We pray the Lord's Prayer, and we have a confession point in our where we have read confessions every week. So we corporate confession together. So all of those, I think, anchor to me. They are things that I can rely on and anchor me back into what's important. And they anchor me into a process that has been going on for a very, very long time. And Christians have been doing it through time. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why we do that. And it's familiar. So once you come a few times, you understand, this is a time when we're going to be quiet and pray. This is the time we're reciting the creed. So there are things that you can quickly lock into. We don't have a ton of them. There's not a lot of standing, sitting, what you might get in Catholic Church.
Because you all do these things, but the way in which you do them, having experienced some of them with you, doesn't feel anything like what other people might have experienced. Oddly, it does, but it doesn't.
Oddly enough, if you grew up Catholic, you'll come to the village, and a lot of people who do, like, one of the reasons I stuck here is because it felt a lot like when I was a kid, but different.
Yeah. Familiar enough, but different. And I have heard that actually in our context.
Yeah,
there's
it's very liturgical.
People will say, I can see that you're liturgical, but it comes across very different. Yeah. And ours is a different version than yours, maybe a little less, there's some
more
other subtle
formalities that you have that we don't, and
vice versa.
Vice versa. Yeah, definitely.
Did you grow up with any of this?
I grew up with what people would call low church.
Yeah.
So I grew up Brethren Church.
The Brethren.
Which is, for people who don't know who they are, you link them to the Mennonites. I mean, they're at some level there.
Often pacifistic, or were originally.
Yes, originally pacifistic. They don't have paid pastors. They have elders. It's an elder-driven church with nobody being paid. So there's not that. They do communion every week. They have a communion service before you go to church.
Oh, okay.
And so I grew up with that until I was 7. And then I just basically grew up in Baptist church until we returned to the Brethren when I was in high school for a little bit. And then I went back to the regular non-denominational world.
Yeah. So you've had a bit of a tour, but not
on the high church.
Not on the high church.
My father, on the other hand, grew up Catholic and has strong Catholic ties, even though he never took us to the Catholic Church. So I do have a bit of the appreciation for that.
And my dad grew up Lutheran, but never in my life did we. I mean, I actually went to the Lutheran church. His family kind of stewarded, co-founded maybe once in my entire life. And that was in Bisbee. And so he was in the Lutheran church up until almost when I was born, because he and my mom met later in life, and they dated and married pretty quickly. And he was in the Lutheran church until then. I didn't even know that until later, because my mom had become a Christian in the Pentecostal church.
Okay.
And my dad was open to that. And I just learned this on our trip with my mom, that the reason my dad was as open to it as he was because the Pentecostal church gave him space to play music. He was a musician.
Oh, cool.
And so he would come and play music with the Pentecostals because there was space for that. And so then when my mom was wanting to be involved there, it wasn't so drastic for him.
An easy transition for him.
Yeah, and this was a milder Pentecostalism, honestly, than some have experienced. And so I grew up first in the Pentecostal church, and that's even where we were when we moved to Tucson and went to what was called Victory. I just found out Victory just changed its name.
To
Zion City Church. Yeah, I did not know that until recently. The Victory of our day when we moved here is very different than the Victory people have known for the past 10, 15 years. But it was also very different from what we experienced in a small town.
Right.
And it didn't click. And we ended up going to a mega sort of Baptist church, which here is called Casas. That's where we went for a while. So not liturgical at all. And then there was a tour for me personally in working in some churches and doing internships and such. The closest, Chicago, when I moved there in my early 20s, I was Christian Reformed. And that was the most liturgical I had ever experienced. And it was actually in South Chicago. So it was a fusion of liturgical and kind of black gospel.
Which got to be pretty interesting.
It was cool, but I've never, that's kind of its own unique situation. But, yeah, so that's where I think that all factors in. So for me, I think deciding to add in liturgy for me, it was a conversation when I was interning in a church plant. I read things like Rhythms of Grace by Mike Cosper. That got me interested. But even what I've added in probably feels like very little to some, but
right.
There you go. Okay. Sustainable. When you see younger people flocking, or you just gave me some stats. You should talk about that before we started the podcast that you had seen. But when you see kind of younger people, like Jacob brought up, they're engaging with Peterson or something like that, and they're going, I'm going to try Orthodox.
Right.
He asked the question about, is that sustainable? What do you think?
Well, I guess the interesting question is, the thing to look at, I think there are two categories of people. One category are people who, let's say they became Christians in a campus ministry, and then the church itself, they ended up at, Vanilla Baptist, Vanilla Lutheran, whatever. They ended up at a church out of college, and it's like, oh, this isn't have the same substance in their mind.
I hope there is a church called Vanilla Baptist.
That would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? I should look that up. Vanilla Baptist Church. And so they begin to explore their faith, and they find that there are these things like within the Orthodox Church where they say, oh, well, we can trace ourselves all the way back to Peter and the laying on of hands through all of our priests. And by the way, the Orthodox can actually do that much better than the Catholics. But the Catholics say the same thing. And so their worship is anchored in 2,000 years of history, and that becomes substantial, and then you begin to experience something different than Vanilla Baptist, and so you move from that. And there have been movements out of Campus Crusade, movements out of a number of different... Oh, the plumber is here, so we're going to pause.
Turns out we didn't have to pause. Actually, I
was in a big old...
We were only gone for 10 seconds.
10 seconds. And I'm not quite sure what I was saying, but...
You were in movements out of Campus Crusade.
Yeah, Campus Crusade and other communities where you see these transitions. The other category, I think, is what Jacob was talking about, is friends who were not followers of Jesus begin to be exposed to people like Jordan Peterson and others, and they are really trying to think about what is true and what is good. And so they feel this call back to church. But maybe what they see as the secular, or from a secular perspective, the church itself in the Protestant world seems a little bit maybe shallow or not intellectual enough or whatever.
Or disconnected.
And so they want to move for something that seems more substantial, and to them, something that's ancient seems more substantial.
Yeah.
So they're headed there to find out about God and who he is.
And I guess when I think about sustainable, that word or that question, what comes to mind for me is I tend to think yes and no. I mean, it depends on the particular journey here. Will some people find something that just they really embed this into their lives? Yeah, quite possibly. For some people, is this just another thing that's being tried, toes dipped in? Sure, probably. I think that, what might be going for those more liturgical and historical churches, and as far as sustainability goes, is these practices will be there most likely in another 50 years.
Yes.
They could be returned to, they can be remembered, they're shaping. Whereas if you jump into your kind of more typical non-denominational church, that whole church, from what we've observed over the past decade, could be an utterly different church in 5 years.
Right.
And so that is very disruptive to somebody who kind of comes in, is shaped, formed there, and then, it's a new pastor comes in, it's a whole nother ball game.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something I've seen. And even though we started outside of a denomination, more with friends and neighbors, I hope we aren't, on this like drastic change trajectory that I've seen a lot of other churches go through. We could probably sit down and name churches in town that look nothing like they looked 10 years ago.
Right. And they're personality driven a lot of times.
Yes.
And certainly I know from
driven by what's popular. Like,
yes.
You could, whether it's music styles or ways of communicating.
Yes.
Sure.
Whereas with the Catholic Church, yes, the parish priests are very different. But the liturgy is the same. And so it's familiar. You can go from parish to parish, and you can feel okay and comfortable in this, and safe to explore things. And you're not going to, most of the time, you won't find things out of bounds or different.
You can, but
yes, but it's relatively the same.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've brought up before, like burger joints and stuff like that, as far as how churches should be. This is very maybe tangential, but also could be interesting. It's, when you go to the Orthodox Church, in a way, it's like if you go to In-N-Out Burger in Tucson versus California, you're going to get the same experience. Will the manager be different? Will the employee have a different twinkle in their eye? Perhaps.
Will it be shaped slightly different?
Yeah, barely.
Barely, yeah.
But overall, you're going to get the same thing. You can expect it. And then some of us go, oh, that's so nice. That's so refreshing. And others go, yeah, it's boring. I want to try the local place that feels like the culture. And I don't know if there's a perfect version of that for the church. It seems like a hybrid of that to me would be good.
Sure.
If there were some things, and I would say this in all Christian churches, that people could generally expect. I get to be in discussions these days on a denominational level about church planting, and I think people are asking questions about, does preaching need to be there? Does music need to be there? Or what if we all just did kind of missional enterprises and we met up and talked about that? Is that church doing life with Jesus's people, spending time together? And I'm not so much a proponent of that. I think that there should be worship. I think that we're commanded to worship in the Bible, not just so God can control us, but because we're built to worship. And if we aren't formed to worship Christ, God in Christ, we will worship other things first and foremost, even in our missional endeavors. And so I'm a believer that there needs to be worship, and by worship I don't mean necessarily bands and stuff, but expressions of praise to God.
Right.
And I think that we do need to hear from, I think we gather to hear from God, so that's where the word comes into play. And then grace is administered to us by Christ, and that's where things like the table and the Lord's Supper, I personally think that those things and oversight and discipleship and or discipline of the church, I believe those things you should expect that everywhere, But then I also kind of have the side of me that thinks it should feel kind of like the place you're in.
Yeah.
I'm a proponent of that combo.
Yeah. And I think, I agree with you. And I think those are I think those are attractive churches to be part of. I think the thing that's interesting to me is I do think that there is, with young white men, this, especially young white intellectuals, who are feeling in some level, maybe in the public eye, being kind of the target.
Sure.
And they're trying to figure out what is good and right.
Yeah.
And so they're on a search. And Jordan Peterson has touched that, because in some ways they found that, sitting in mom's basement doesn't really have a lot of meaning, and people want to have meaning in their life. Yeah. And you see this in particular. I don't know how many people have been listening to The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. We did a little bit of an episode on that, but it attracted young white men. Yeah, and especially. What you see in the documentary is that the message was attractive. Be a man, take care of your family. And I think there's a longing within men to have meaning and substance, and to help someone and to do something in the world. And so I do actually think,
and that's not all. I should say, despite what Driscoll did with that,
it's not bad.
It's not all bad. Yeah.
No. I think sometimes the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church gives you a place to begin in that. Yeah. To feel like, okay, well, I'm going to connect to something with deep meaning and purpose and a history to be explored. And some of the greatest thinkers like Aquinas and Augustine,
Thomas
Merton, all these, so there's such richness. And so you're going to want to be part of this, and maybe that will help you make sense of what's happening in this world and what spirituality is and what faith is. And I think especially from people who are really, really smart and who are well educated, and they're wrestling with that, because those are the people you're seeing come back to these churches. Mm-hmm. It's not, and I'm not saying that, your average everyday mechanic or your, people who do blue collar jobs are not smart, because they're brilliant, but they aren't actually the people flocking back to church in these Orthodox communities and Catholic communities. It is
generally educated.
Generally. And certainly as soon as I say that, some guy is going to email and say, well, I work at the grocery store, and I came back to the Orthodox Church, or whatever, but I went to the Orthodox.
But if you were to talk as far as large samples go,
it's not. And so what is that saying? I mean, I think our culture doesn't give men in general a lot of place to have a voice in a good way. Certainly we have lots of voice and power, and in not in a bad way, but we're not like, how do I take responsibility for who I am and have meaning and purpose in life? There's no coming of age things that we practice or anything like that.
Well, another thing that more liturgical churches do is they offer structure. And and as much as we tend to run from structure, we clearly in our culture also long for it and need it. So in an age of remote work, I mean, I tend to look at, maybe I'm a glass half full guy. I don't know if I am, actually. I get down on a lot of things, but I tend to see these opportune moments.
1/3 full.
Yeah. And one of those opportune moments to me is post-pandemic, a lot of remote work. People are moving to our city because of the ability to work remotely. What things are there that are structured that you can depend on when you make your own schedule? You kind of shape your own life. You decide you're like, right. I'm just going to adventure, and I'll get my work done. That leaves this major box unchecked, and that box is something to kind of pattern my life after, to live for, to depend on. And I think that those traditions offer some of that. And some people might run to that temporarily, and others might really find a home in some of those rituals in the good sense. And it's probably kind of a mixed bag. But I think it's a need, and maybe when people feel like they're boxed in by all of their various traditions, I mean, society-wide, maybe there's that movement toward more free-form churches.
Right.
And when people feel like there's nothing consistent anymore, they move back toward things like structured worship.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think my answer to the question is it sustainable? I would say yes and no. Like anything in the move of the Spirit of God, some people are going to go to the Catholic Church. They're going to find Jesus. They're going to live their life for Jesus. And they're going to stay in the Catholic or Orthodox Church or the Anglican Church, a place with high liturgies and more ancient kind of connections in the way that they think of themselves. And that's awesome. And some are going to go and they're not going to like it and they're going to leave. And maybe they'll end up at a Protestant church, or maybe they'll walk away from everything completely. That's how the Spirit works.
Yeah.
He moves in these movements and people find him and they hold on to him, and others find him and walk away from him. It's how this works. And God doesn't have any problem using the Orthodox Church or the Vanilla Baptist Church.
Right. They
bring
all
you to him.
They all have their place. A few conversations. Well, one, John Foreman, the lead singer of Switchfoot, kind of surprised people at one point when he, said that he really was more of a liturgical worship. That was his preference. Here's a rock and roll star.
Right.
But he was like, I live rock and roll every day. That's not what I want when I come before God and worship.
Right.
And I had a similar conversation with a guy, and this was not a believer, but he was a rave DJ, and we were talking about church. This was years ago, and he said, if I were to go, I would want to go somewhere where it felt transcendent and where there were rituals. And I was so surprised because I said, "You're a rave guy." And he goes, "Yeah." Again, like he said, that's my whole life is, it's crazy.
All right.
I want peace and tranquility, and I want to sit and stand, and I want those things. And then similarly, another friend of mine that too, I had a conversation with the other day, and as a generation ahead of me was struggling with why younger people are into this liturgy stuff, and he was coming more from, he had wanted the freedom when he was younger, and it's surprising to him that his kids want structure and liturgy. And there's probably movements of time and trends and everything that affects how the things that we connect with. And
right. And I actually think, oddly enough, inside the church where you have people who grew up in the church, and let's say in the Vanilla Baptist Church, part of the reason that they're looking for that structure is 9 times out of 10, their parents have moved 3 or 4 churches.
Yes.
Because things weren't, so they don't have the consistency.
That's actually, as I just briefly think about it, I've seen that to be very true.
And it's almost always those people who their children are looking for something more stable.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true for me. I bounced around a ton of churches when I was a kid. I don't want, even if I weren't a pastor, I will, even if I don't like what's happening in this church, as long as they fit inside the Orthodox, belief system, I'm going to stay there.
You're just tired of getting dragged around.
Yeah. I just want to be able to be in the people I know, with a liturgy I know, and a structure that I understand, and then I can commit to following Jesus in that and being myself. And
one of the things I saw as a middle school youth leader back in the day was that parents always felt like they needed to move and have a nicer house for their kids, more space.
Mm-hmm.
And the kids usually didn't like it. They typically missed the little old house they used to have. The move is chaotic.
It's so hard on children.
And by the time they finally settled in, they're going off to college.
Right.
And then the family downsizes the house.
Right.
And then the kid doesn't even have that to come back to.
Right.
So they come back to a house they never had. And there's a ton, I mean, that's a very new phenomenon. That didn't used to
No, it did not
happen. And so these kids don't have a home. And I think that's very true of church. Like, this quest to find the best church for your kids often leaves your kids feeling like they never had a home.
Right.
And things aren't stable. And that's probably just that's a life connecting that with house. I think that's so true of their parents don't have the same job. They don't have the same neighbors. They don't.
Right. And actually, for the most part, because I've done college ministry and I've done high school ministry and I've done singles ministry, and now I have been a pastor for 20 years. What I have learned is that most children, now this is not the rule overall, but most children don't care about the youth group. They care about the youth in their community, wherever they go to church, but that's their place.
Yes.
And they like the adults, they like the kids. They don't care if there's 30 of them. No. Now, sometimes if they go to a church and there's no peers their age and it happens that's a little bit difficult. But even then, they begin to make friends with adults, or younger kids.
So our church just, it's been a year of having this youth small group. My daughter wanted to tell the whole church about it. I'll tell you what, she brings a couple friends from school here and there. Her favorite thing about this youth small group is these like young adults in the church who take time and are interested in her too. It's not that it's a bunch of kids her age. It's that other adults in the church are interested in her and want to know about her life. And she connects with them, not just in that small group, but just at church in general.
Right.
So in many ways, she doesn't have this youth group at our church. I'm the pastor, right? So there's in a way, she doesn't have a lot of options, but she likes our. When we went on vacation recently and visited other churches, she several times was like, "I miss our church."
Yes, when we go on vacation, I take a month off.
Yeah.
My kids, we go to other services on vacation. My kids refuse to go to the other churches. They want to go to the village, and they get very upset if they cannot go to the village.
Yeah.
So it's their church.
Totally.
And it's not as much as it's mine. And so they don't want to miss it. It's their friends, their worship. Yep. They have things they offer that they want to offer, and they don't want to miss out on offering them.
Yep. Exactly. So, and right. Yeah. Younger kids are a factor in that with my daughter too. And anyway, so it's stability. And maybe ancient forms provide that, but maybe it's just partially not always trying to find the better thing.
Yeah. I like that.
All right. Well, we can end on that note then.
All right.
Hey, Jacob, thanks for the question.
Yes,
that was
thank
great.
You, Jacob.
And even though the books are gone, you can always email us with any questions, faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com. If you rate us, it means a lot because that means that it shows up a little more on people's searches and such. So we appreciate you taking the time to listen. And Eric, because of these pauses, gets to invest more time in editing.
So maybe you'll be able to hear Andy. I've never not been able to hear Andy, but some of you think you can't. So I'm going to give him a little bit of a boost this week. Andy will have a boost.
Hey, Yay. Andy boost.
You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.